Good morning and welcome to the next masterclass as part of the Global Family Business Summit organised here by Family Business United. I'm Paul Andrews, the founder of Family Business United, an organisation that celebrates and champions the contribution of family firms around the world. And today's session is all about Generation Z or Generation Z, depending on where you're based, the workforce of the future. And I'm delighted to welcome Alex Atherton to talk to us this morning about the topic and how to recruit, retain and motivate what's being seen as the best of the youngest generation in the workplace. Alex, over to you for what hopes going to be an interesting session looking at some of the challenges that most family businesses are going to have to address at some point.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Paul. And hi, everybody. Paul, before I start, are you a Gen Z or a Gen Z person? Because I'll stick to one throughout, I think.
Probably a Gen Z, to be honest. Which
Gen Z.
Yeah.
Okay. Gen Z it is. Okay. Well, thanks for your time, everybody. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a whistle-stop tour. The QR code that's on the screen now takes my site. If you go to the blogs, there's a lot more detail on the different components of what I'm going to talk about today. And I'll introduce myself and why I'm talking about Gen Z in a moment. So just to break down the content a little bit today, I'll talk a bit about what is the generation, just go into the concept very briefly, just so we're all on the same page with that. I'll talk about who are Gen Z, the whole concept of generations. People are quite familiar with that, the idea of who's the best actor, singer, football player, politician, whatever it is of their generation, but just how it works with this particular piece of analysis. I want to be clear on that. I'll go through a couple of key characteristics as I see it of Gen Z, but I'll spend at least half the time looking at some solutions for the key challenges, and then we'll have time for some questions at the end. Now, in terms of challenges, there's no better reference point to take than the Family Business United survey. 7 top challenges that are there. In particular, I'm going to look at this one, recruiting, retaining and motivating staff. I know that isn't all about Gen Z, but I know in terms of the conversations I have with people, whether it's in one-to-one coaching sessions, whether it's working with leadership teams, whether it's talking to audiences such as this, it is a big one. But I also think these other ones are covered here too in some way, and as far as my content is concerned, likely all of them. So I know it's a hot topic. Right, so why am I talking about them at all? Well, 15 years ago, this was me. So my background was in education. I was in education for nearly 25 years, and I spent just over half of that time as a secondary school head teacher. And the school I spent the most time in is pictured here. It's a 11 to 18 school at the time in Tottenham, North London. And what I remember was a really switched on, up for it, ambitious bunch of kids. I came out of schools, working in schools full-time 5 years ago. I now work with senior leaders, CEOs, directors, and people who want to be any of those things. But I started hearing this generation described in a way that I didn't really, I couldn't really see for myself, but it didn't match my experience of them, but also in ways that I didn't appreciate. And I started to see headlines like this. And I had one coaching client after another saying, we can't recruit young staff, we can't keep them, we can't motivate them, we can't engage them. And then in the next sentence saying to me, we're definitely having some issues with some of our young snowflake staff. I thought, well, I think I can see how these things go together. But I think what particularly got to me was that the criticisms were coming from people in my own generation. And I'm pretty certain we went through the same experience back in time of being criticised for X, Y, and Z by the generation above. But when I saw headlines like this, I also thought people are missing the point. I also thought there are some solutions here. So I started researching, I started reading, and I started talking to people from the generation. Just be clear who I'm talking about in terms of age brackets and so on. This is very roughly a guide. They're not official figures. They don't appear on your birth certificate. They don't appear on your passport. It is a construct. but until quite recently, they were defined in retrospect. Those who grew up during the era where children were seen and not heard, or the silent generation, generally weren't described as that. Anyone born in the late 40s wasn't described as another addition to the boomer generation at that point. It came later. It's only in relatively recent years, Gen X, the generation that refused to be defined, but even then I think was quite a late term that was used. Millennials, so-called, because the eldest of that generation turned of age around the time of the millennium. And Gen Z, I've seen different figures. People refer to 95, 96, 97. I just take it as 95, and for simplicity's sake, to have 15 years all-inclusive as the length of a generation. Now, also is very convenient, particularly, Alpha. Some of them are not born yet, but we're almost there, and presumably, we'll be onto the beta generation after that. But it's not just about a convenient division of time. It's about the economic, social, political, technological changes which affect the outlook of a generation and which also affect their approach to work and the workplace, which is where the relevance of this talk comes in. But if I'll just put them on the timeline. Now, I'm wary of guillotines between generations. We're not talking about different species here. I would always strongly recommend that people are treated as individuals and so on. There'll be much more variety of outlook and personality within a generation than across them. But if, for example, you and your siblings were born here, they will have more in common in terms of their own experiences than a young Gen X against someone born in the mid-60s, or an older millennial against someone born in 95. But although you might well find that as the younger one came through school and so on, there were different technology was available, maybe someone else was in government and so on. And if anyone on the call has got, for example, children in primary and secondary, I'm sure you will see some changes over time. Most of Gen Z, or Gen Z, I said it was Gen Z, have gone through school without AI being as big a feature of their education as what is coming through. But in general, I'm not a fan of guillotines and so on. If they were born close together, they'll have similar experiences, but there are differences over time. But with Gen Z, people underrate the numbers of how many are in the workplace now. We're only a couple of years away from Gen Z being over a quarter of the UK workforce, and only 7 years from being over a third of the global workforce. And with every passing year, given that the youngest Gen Z are still in school and the oldest are in the workplace, the percentages are increasing. Now, the numbers of Gen Z in each trade or profession will vary. Gyms and hospitality tend to have younger staff, and so I'm very certain they're well above a quarter already. It will vary. But briefly, just going to some of the key markers between different generations. Well, it's the boomers, post-war till the mid-60s, Gen X from mid-60s to late 70s, millennials born in the 80s to the mid-90s, and Gen Z from the mid-90s to the end of the zeros. There are differences. And I haven't even included there for Gen Z, the impact of climate change, we could say, has actually been an issue for some time, but it's now, perhaps it's getting more headlines than it ever has. Not all of these events happened in the time when this generation was born. It's about the extent to which it affects them in their late childhood and early adult life. Gen Z, the pandemic clearly affected everybody. But I'd argue for Gen Z, if organizations were having to do a lot of last in was first out, it was that generation which was affected the most. So let's go into some key characteristics. I'm not going to go overboard on this. I'm just going to go through a couple. And the couple that I suppose gain the most surprise when I talk about this content elsewhere with other audiences. Now, the first one I'm going to talk about is pragmatic. Now, I'm often told actually it's the opposite. Gen Z is idealistic. They want to be hyper successful. They want to be huge entrepreneurs. They want to be influencers. They want things that perhaps they shouldn't be expecting at a young age. Well, let's unpick that a little bit. So pragmatism. Almost 2/3 Gen Z want their own business. Now, a year ago, I was talking about that figure. It was somewhere in the early 40s. There were other surveys available, but with each survey that comes through, that figure seems to go higher and higher. And what I see as most significant about that figure is not just how high it is, but it's at least twice as high as for any other generation. So the question is, why is that pragmatic? Well, I'll come to that, because the numbers are huge. I think that figure now is probably past 200,000 running their own businesses, as directors, or that there might be the solopreneurs, or the small setup, whatever it might be. But a huge factor here is their concern about their long-term prospects. If you are in your mid to late 20s, during your secondary schooling, there was austerity affecting levels of funding for the public services that you were using at the time, because you used them a lot when you're that age. They've experienced the aftermath of Brexit. Whatever your views on that, it might be or not. It's certainly been an interesting period of time. They've also seen a pandemic. They've seen a series of events come from places, apparently, unprecedented, unforeseen, and all those kinds of things. And by having your own business, you're helping to spread the risk, because a lot of people who have their own business, it is a side hustle. It's not necessarily their main gig. And when I talk to leaders who say one of the issues they've got with young staff is that they leave on the dot, I say, well, I bet if you ask them, you'll find out they've got another job. They're running something. They've got their own website. They're buying and selling things in the evenings, whatever else it might be. So they need multiple streams of income out of necessity. Before the pandemic, if you'd ask people, if there is a pandemic, what kinds of work do you think will be affected the most? People wouldn't have necessarily had an answer. And the type of pandemic we had as well, certain industries, hit very badly. And I'm sure there's people, on this call where that happened to them. But partly this is about being able to pay the rent. Partly it's about trying to be able to move out of home. It's about trying to pay bills and all these kinds of things. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they're not entrepreneurial and so on. But if you don't have the kind of control over your life that previous generations might have had in terms of getting your own place, and all those kinds of things, this is something that you might want to take ownership of. But the need to meet the cost of living also means that the youngest generation are having to earn income in different ways. And beyond all that, if you are working for an organization and you don't like their values and so on, it's not hard to start your own. I'll return to that point down the line. Now, just to show something here, I could have used registrations at Companies House as an example of that. And you might have noticed on the news today, the number of dissolutions has gone up considerably. It went up in 2022 as well, and it was matched by the increased number of new companies being formed and registered at Companies House as well. But as Gen Z hit adult life, as they hit the age where they're in the workplace, the number of Companies House registrations also went up considerably. And the same is true for something like Etsy. If you're not familiar with the site, it's where people who make things, design things, and so on, posters, lots of Christmas gifts. You can set up your own shop within Etsy and gain customers that way. And it's true that during the pandemic, the number of new shops rocketed. But actually, the years before that, it tripled in a seven-year period of time. And okay, this is all registrations, not just Gen Z, but it gives them ownership, it gives them some control, it gives them some flexibility, and not least income, which when it tripled again in the 2 years during the pandemic was very necessary. But I would also say, yeah, okay, there's still plenty of young people doing jobs in, bars and supermarkets and all those kind of things. But there's a lot of them operating online, which can be great for income, not always so good for giving them experience of the workplace and the soft skills you acquire with that. And again, I'll return to that down the line. So number one, pragmatic. Number two, diligent. This generation works hard. I'll show you one key example of this. These are the outcomes of degree classifications in English universities over the 2010s. It's not so easy to learn too much from 2020, 21 or 22 during the pandemic and immediately after that. Although I will say the percentage of first-class degrees has gone up again during that period of time. I think the last set of figures has it as over a third, but it doubled across the course of the 2010s. And that also comes in a time when the number of students going to universities also increased by approximately a sixth. Now, I could also show you figures about A-level results, GCSE outcomes as well. You could argue, well, the universities need to prove their worth for what it costs to go to university and so on. You could say that the debt incurred from university is reason enough to get best value out of it. But the same is true for a generation coming through with an uncertain, at best, economy and with a much greater sense of international competition. My view is that those messages cut through. This generation works hard. It's not an accident that they're getting these stellar academic outcomes. Now, briefly, I'll just put up the list of the others that I see it. That QR code will take you straight to the blog. There's one on each of them, videos and so on, if you want to look at that in more depth, or even into the pragmatic and diligent points in more depth. But I'm now going to go into approximately the second half and look at some solutions. And solutions for, just going back to the title of the talk, about recruitment, retaining and motivating the best of the youngest generation in the workplace. And I'm going to cheat a little bit with this first one. I'm going to combine two solutions together. I've got content for all of these, apart from one actually, which I've put in for today. But this is putting two of them together. So solution one is be clear, be thorough, be who you say you are. So this is a solution about clarity and detail. Because after all, I think there's a real challenge now in getting anybody, and perhaps anybody young, to join any organisation. Because it's so easy to set up your own. And I think sometimes people in my generation find this quite threatening, because we were very used to the idea that somebody 20 to 30 years older than us would be giving us our first job. And they'd be deciding on our first promotion, second promotion, all those kinds of things. And the truth is, in this day and age, the youngest generation doesn't necessarily need us. In the course of all of this, I've worked with, there was one organisation in particular where the entire staffing was Gen Z. Now, they did need people from older generations, but not on their payroll. They needed them for law, for accountancy, for services, and all those kinds of things. But you can have a great idea having a chat with friends on a Saturday night. And then Sunday, you register at company's house. Monday, you set up your business bank account. Tuesday, you buy a URL and chuck a website together on Wix or Squarespace. And then by the end of the week, you've got your first sale. And then the next week, you can do it again if you want. It's really difficult. And there's an agility here which joining someone else's organization does not match. And on top of that, I think there is an issue with trust in traditional organizations. I think organization, I think perhaps in this country in particular, an organization that's existed for 80 years, 100 years, hundreds of years, I don't think is necessarily as venerated by the youngest generation as might have been the case before. From the conversations I've had, a lot of Gen Z look at what they've inherited in terms of climate change, inequality, discrimination, and so on. And I think, well, why can't we do better? Why can't we offer more effective leadership than what's been given to us before? As it happens, their tendency to vote is a little bit stronger at the same age than previous generations. But then if that's what you've got left, I'm not surprised that they engage. Now, I'll return to that point later on. Live for the present. I don't want to set up the idea this is a hugely laissez-faire attitude. Let's just do do what we like and see what comes, because it's going to be great. Again, I think this is about pragmatism. Anybody as young as even their late 20s are seeing strong evidence of sudden and apparently unexpected change. Again, global financial crash, Brexit, COVID, and so on. The idea of a long-term, stable future with a single choice of employer doesn't feel particularly realistic in this day and age. And given the level of effort and emotional investment that joining an organisation can be, which can disappear at the drop of a hat, it's a less attractive proposition. So what to do? What do I mean by be clear, be thorough, and so on? I would say in every single angle of what you do and what you want potential candidates to know, you need to lay it out. Assume no prior knowledge. Go for maximum transparency. Avoid polish. I think to my generation, marketing can still mean glossy and so on. I think that's seen with quite a level of distrust, actually. The key word is authenticity. But I'd also say to organizations, be clear about what you really want. Because sometimes I talk to people and they say, well, we just have to take whatever's there because there's just so little. And my view on that is that you might not be looking in the right places. You might not be clear enough about who you are, what you stand for, and what you're looking for. And your processes for recruitment and selection may not be strong enough. They might not be robust enough. Actually, if you gear your selection processes for what you really want and you cast the net wider, you might find exactly what you're looking for in a way that you come to expect that you won't. But detail also inspires trust. In a younger generation, it was a clickbait thrown at them, for their entire adult life and for an awful lot of their childhood as well. It inspires trust when an organization shows that they have thought things through, because it gives the impression that the next time there's an economic crisis, a pandemic, a constitutional problem, or whatever it is, you might be in a position to survive. You also help to anticipate questions. If, for example, the job requires your staff to undertake tasks which actually, in theory, could be automated, or they might not be best suited, explain why and explain the support that will be in place. They understand the need for efficiency. So if something on face value presents as an issue, just be clear on the value that you see it adds. Just lay it all out. Because the battle for retention starts with recruitment, and it particularly starts as soon as they get there. Be ultra clear on who you are, your values, and where you're going. And in this day and age, some of my generation of right in the middle of Gen X, I might think, actually, I'm just repeating myself here. This is ridiculous. But whereas actually, I think Gen Z, they need that reassurance. They are very used to the repetition of messages. If the same message stops, they may well wonder why it has. Has something changed that we've not been told? If the direction of where you're going and how you're going about it deviates, I would say so. Keep that transparency going throughout, because the trust that you've got as them coming in probably needs to be managed more than you might think is reasonable. So that's solution one. Solution two, personal and professional development. I've split that for a reason. I argue that organizations need to be prepared to invest more in the former, the personal, than previously, but also more in the latter too. And not least because Gen Z's expectations of what will be available to them are higher, including in the personalization of the development opportunities they are given. I'm not going to talk today about feedback we might get as employees, but I've written quite a lot about that and what they've got used to receiving in the school system to get the next grade, and those kinds of things. But I'm just going to deal with the trope to begin with, because I feel this is a real strength, the younger generation, which is sometimes taken to be a weakness. I think anyone who's got or has had a teenage son or daughter, will recognize their ability to have an incredible number of windows and applications going on at the same time. And yes, I had to cheat to put that together so I could screenshot it from my own screen. But you can see the family business logo there twice, in fact, because I had to cheat to have so many open. But the reason I'm raising it is, it's often said to me, well, they've got a real concentration problem. They can't concentrate on anything for more than 2 minutes. You know, TikTok is all 8-10 seconds, you know, content and so on and so on. And my reply to that is, if that is true, then they wouldn't be getting those degree outcomes and they wouldn't be getting those A-level outcomes. If they couldn't sustain it for 2 to 3 hours in those kinds of circumstances without technology, then the performance would be dipping. And that's not true. Their ability to multitask is at a whole new level. Now, this was a Time magazine headline not long ago. And I think actually that's not quite true. You might have the ability, or you might tend to click from one thing to another, but that doesn't mean that they can't concentrate for long periods of time. And to take a rather flippant example, the new Spider-Man 2 PS5 game came out 10 days ago, and my nephews are cheerfully putting in 16-hour shifts at the weekend on that. You know, they can concentrate. So personal and professional development. Ultra detailed onboarding. Having been ultra clear of what you want for recruitment, that needs to set the tone and not a one-off event. Retention starts with onboarding. But I'd also argue you need to be prepared to train for aspects that you didn't expect to have to do so, and that perhaps you might also find unreasonable as well. So whether it's about dress code, engaging with social media, you know, email conventions, all those kinds of things. There's so much, take myself as the Gen Xer, there's so much that we learned as adults and then translated, you know, into the technology. You know, I was in a senior leadership position in the school, I think, before I ever sent a work email. And that's quite hard to believe now, I think, for the younger generation. But we learned a lot of these soft skills and then applied them to new technology. Rather than, because of these, engaged with your peer group extensively in social media in a way that parents and teachers, frankly, at the start of all of that, had no clue about the power of all of that. And then trying to translate that into adult life is a very different challenge. But I also argue you'll be rewarded for the investment that you make. But I'd say on average, and I'm speaking broadly about huge numbers of people here, the qualifications they'll come in with will be staggering. The soft skills they might have may not be quite as strong as was the case before. The schooling, and I know this from own experience, running schools can be very invested in the academic side, not as strong in the personal development side. You know, it can be less instinctive about being instinctive, perhaps. Having said that, if you lay on the opportunities and the program and the investment in the real world skills you want them to have, I do think you'll be rewarded, because I think they will hoover that up. So if you put the resource in front of them, that's how they're ending up with these A-level grades and degrees in the first place, because they are heavily resourced. And the same can apply to their initial time in the workplace of their initial years. There was a survey that came out last month. A couple of thousand participants, I think relatively evenly split between the UK and the US. And this explains the gap beautifully for me. 85% Gen Z graduates believe key soft skills are essential for advancing in the workplace, yet only 40%, 2/5 of them, so 40% say they receive no training, onboarding, or support to develop these skills. Now, again, in selection, if you test for some of these soft skills more, you might find that you end up in a stronger starting position, and they can fill your gaps too, how to network, online technology, all those kinds of things. But these skills are not going to come about just by happenstance. I think if you invest in that period and make it clear and in recruitment that that's what you do, you'll be rewarded for it. 3, so this is 3 out of 4. Enable contributions and collaboration. Now, here's a typical scenario. I have a coaching client say to me, I received this email from this 22-year-old that said, "Hi, first name. I've got some feedback on the organisation for my first couple of weeks here. Hope you don't mind." Well, a lot of them do mind. Now, let's unpick that. You are going to get feedback whether you ask for it or not in this day and age, so you may as well set up the channels to facilitate it. You're also, as a leader, more likely to be asked for one-to-one time, more one-to-one time than you might have expected in the past. So I'd be clear on the boundaries of what you will offer and where they can get that from. But it's more than this, though. It's about a sense that you want them and you will value their contribution to the overall success of the organization, not just areas that are specific to their team or job description. Get them involved in the bigger picture and enable them to collaborate in doing so. And be prepared to ask them the questions where you might feel uncomfortable with the answers. After 6 months, has their experience lived up to what you advertised? Far better to have that conversation then than in an exit interview 6 months later after they'd left after the first year, after all you put in to get them. Because this is a generation that contributes. This was a survey from Deloitte a couple of years ago. There's 11 categories, 5 on this first page. The extent to which millennials in the light green and Gen Zs in that teal colour, the second colour, that they take action to drive the change they want to see in the world. Gen Z wants to contribute, they want to make decisions, and they want to have some ownership. I saw one comment on Glassdoor about a large gym chain, and it said, someone who'd left said, "I want to be a real manager and not to have to refer to the handbook for every decision." They understand the need for efficiency and, of course, for clarity, but they're still interested in problem solving and making a difference. Because out of these first 5 categories, Gen Z is ahead of millennials in 3 of them. Level on 1 and behind only in the one that depends on having some disposable income. And when it comes to the second set, they're ahead in all. Now, I would argue that a greater propensity to attend a public meeting, a political event, to campaign, and, as I said earlier, to vote, there's something here that as employers, leaders, and organizations, you can do something with this. And you can get them involved in ideas which might, in theory, be above their station. But somewhere in there, your leaders of the future will come through and they'll come up with things that maybe you wouldn't have done or your top table wouldn't have done. If you give them a chance to be involved and to collaborate with each other and with you in doing so, I think there is payoff in that. And finally, now I've added this in for here. I haven't written a blog on it. I wondered whether to add professions as well. But I remember being at the Family Business Conference early in the year, and there were the decorators, there was the pizza chefs, there was the vegan pizza chefs, the wineries, and so on. And it got me thinking a little bit to why those kinds of jobs might be attractive to the youngest generation. Because for a start, a lot of them are AI proof, and this is a real concern. It was certainly a concern for older people. Right, as what I've done for 30 years about to be obsolete or taken over by a machine. It's definitely an issue for them as well. But also, I think there can be a stability of income that comes with an awful lot of trades, and frankly, better income than they might expect and what they might be told they could get in schools as well. A lot of and for a lot of people, yeah, a physical workplace is still an advantage. Not everyone wants to work from home 5 days a week. You know, easy enough for me, who was able to afford a house that I couldn't have afforded to buy 2 years after I bought it 18 years ago with a room I can do it in. You know, when you're still living at home or there's 8 of you in a house share with 3 bedrooms, you know, not so much fun. Now, whether you want it 5 days a week, that's a whole talk in itself. But I still, and I say this to schools and hospitals as well, actually, the fact that you have colleagues, interaction, and a cafe and so on, actually might be more of an advantage to some than you might realise. Not everybody, but to some. But I do think the fact that the jobs that are different from school, that in itself can be a real selling point to a lot of young people. You'll have seen in the news stories about problems with attendance, For me, I think by far the bigger problem is that you've got anywhere between 80 to 100,000 children of school age at any one time who are not on a school roll at all. There's always been an element educated from home. I'm not putting that down, but I think there were quite a few in the pandemic who thought, actually, I prefer this. And school, sitting with pen and paper at desk all day. I think there are some challenges they see to the credibility of that system. So I think for a lot of the businesses that come under FBU, they may have something about them as a workplace that they may not have considered would be an advantage to some. So, 2 key characteristics, 4 solutions, some considerable challenges. Please do reach out and connect. I'm on LinkedIn as Alex Atherton. If in your organizations there's some bespoke support you're looking for, or me to go into this in a bit more detail, or sit down with your directors, whatever it is, or leadership development for young staff as well, I find myself getting called to do. But thank you very much for being on the call, and thank you, Paul, for having me.
Thanks, Alex. There's a lot of content in there to take away. I've got a few questions for you.
Sure. Shall I stop sharing, or?
Yeah, if you could, that'd be great.
Yeah, okay.
You talked about family businesses, or you talked about businesses in general, and authenticity and telling your story. Do you think family firms are a better placed maybe than some other organisations to fight for that Gen Z talent?
I think the idea of something that is local is attractive.
Mm-hmm.
I think something that has got a good story to tell about how it came to be, how it's continued, what have been the values that were there from the beginning and that they've kept going. In some cases, no, this isn't true of family business vary in size hugely. But I think the idea of going into inverted commas, a huge corporate might actually be quite off-putting. Something that's actually smaller, where they can see their way through it and they know everyone by name, all those kinds of things. I think that kind of personal touch that it enables, that provides a welcome contrast to a world where people want to connect with them online, thousands of marketing messages a day, all that sort of that kind of barrage. They've not so welcome. And when it comes to social media, a lot of what is talked about in the media is Twitter, or X as it now is. But I think they just see that as a lot of middle-aged and older people shouting at each other, whereas actually Instagram, as one example, has got many multiples of users than that. And that's generally a kinder place to be. So I think family businesses have got a lot of opportunity to articulate their story and their values and the personal touch in a way that may not have stood out to the same extent 20, 30 years ago.
And you touched on social media there, and I spend my whole life on social media, sharing content and doing what we do. But do you think there's a lot more that needs to be done? And actually, the platforms you talk about TikTok, you talk about Instagram, the world of social media is talked about en masse. But actually, from a Gen Z perspective, there are certain platforms that businesses should be maybe targeting more of their messages to.
For Gen Z, TikTok and YouTube, for that matter, have become the search engines of choice. Actually, even above Google, that video in itself gives authenticity. Of course, you can. Well, we all saw last week with the so-called audio recording of Keir Starmer, and what events going around the world at the moment. What's true, what's not. Video portrays authenticity in general. So I wouldn't advise anybody to be getting involved in all the channels, but actually Instagram, if you want to be where your potential customers are, that is where you will find them. Yeah. And you can get across a lot of powerful, warm messages about yourself, what you do and why you do it, in a way that might have more of an impact than you might imagine. I'm not going to put off people going elsewhere. I think a lot of that generation, a lot more of them are on LinkedIn that might be realized, but I'd say they're because they have to be, rather than they see it as a place where they necessarily want to spend their time. I would say one well-run, interactive, shows something about what it's like to work their Instagram account can go a long way.
So are you talking about things like showing people, I guess, people doing what they do, their jobs, talking about it, engaging with your staff?
And a little bit of case study stuff as well. Here's the person who was there a year ago. How have you found it? All those kinds of things. It's organizations' websites will have text and so on, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you want to, be who you say you are and so on, to actually say it via video rather than electronic ink on digital paper can be at least as effective.
Yeah, and as we say, we all know organisations, especially family firms, are all about the people that work within them. So
absolutely.
What better way to showcase what you do than let your people talk for you and actually engage with people in the public domain?
Yeah, quite. And their connections to the organisation over time, all those kinds of things. I think the stories of, well, you'll have 10, 20 jobs in your lifetime and staying in professions. In theory, it can be exciting. It can also be quite daunting as well, actually. That might be what some people want, but a lot of people might not choose it. The idea of work for an established family firm, put together on strong values and it operates in this way and so on, gives a lot of predictability, and that can also inspire the kind of trust that they're looking for.
Okay, that makes sense. And given as you say, given the generation that's grown up with all of that uncertainty and a pandemic and all that lack of assurance,
exactly,
it's maybe more what they're looking for. If you were talking to family, two more questions from me, really. Do you think families or family businesses, local businesses, engage enough with the school generation whilst they're at school to try and get involved and build those connections? And could they do more?
I suppose it's hard for me to comment on all of it. I think it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of people who were here or people on at the conference would say, do you know what, we try to engage with schools and there's no one to engage with, or it can be hard to get through and all those kinds of things. I think the Gatsby benchmarks, which have been set up now, we've been around for some time with a reasonable expectation that schools are meeting them. I think that is helpful. But I would say reach out and keep reaching out if you don't get an answer first time, not least because the young people will be really grateful that you did, even if the people running the schools might be overrun and just trying to get through the day to day. The last school where I was head, we had forget what we call a corporate board of some kind, and we had like 10 to 12 employees, and those kids got great experiences in the boardrooms they got to sit in, the different things to do. So yeah, I would absolutely say reach out, and if you didn't get where you wanted first time, don't be afraid to go again.
Again, I guess good advice. Having spoken to loads of family businesses the last year, they're all trying to do the right thing, and they always do. Family businesses notoriously try and do the right thing, and it's not all about profit. It's about purpose and making sure they've got sustainable business models. How do you think this will play out maybe in the next 10, 15 years? Do you think it's going to get harder in terms of engagement, and that businesses need to be more innovative in the way they try and engage?
I think that the issues I see with engagement with the school system means there is a window of opportunity for organisations to identify their future staff perhaps earlier than they might have expected.
Okay.
I think there is something with that. It's quite conceivable in the next 10 to 15 years that the social media landscape might change. Maybe the next 1 to 2 years could vary considerably. It's hard to say exactly how AI will develop and so on, but I think that's even more reason to be authentic.
Yeah.
And that's even more reason to keep repeating the same messages you want people to hear, and to take the opportunity to get in front of people face to face and create that reputation with your your future members of the workforce, actually. I think there'll be no shortage of people who want to be ubiquitous on social media and all the rest of it. But the need for proper connections and deep relationships, I think that will only grow in importance.
Okay. I agree with you. In the conversation we've been having recently around governance and the roles of boards, the roles of chairs, defining roles, responsibility, clarity, just you bring all that to life in terms of actually taking it to the next level and engaging with the next generation. I guess my last question for you today, and it's probably a tough one, and apologies, but if you were talking to a family business owner now, which you are, what do you think they should do now in order to increase their chances of success to engage with the next generation and Generation Z?
I think it's important to get an overview of the whole package and how it's set up to recruit people. From the website, from the different activities, from so on. I think you've just got to get an overview of how that looks and to test it out. And if you've got young people who have been with you a year or two, to sit them down and have a real conversation about how they came to be attracted to you, how they found you, and how they think you can find others. The nature of modern WhatsApp groups and so on means they're very connected to their peers and what they find in their own workplace. I think there is a treasure trove there, which I think organizations, you just cannot tap into that stuff enough, and then to pull that together in a plan for how you're going to go about it. Because what might seem natural to people 10, 20, 30 years older might actually be anathema to the younger generation. And it's so important to test that stuff out and see how you're perceived.
So I guess what I'm hearing, Alex, is you're saying ask them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And as I say because often when I talk, there's someone of Gen Z age in the room who is sort of sitting there going, "Oh, what's he doing to talk about this?" I suppose what I say is that it's not that I think the generation needs an advocate, and if they did, they certainly wouldn't choose me. But I did think my own generation wanted to hear a different message.
Yeah, and I think they do need a voice. They need a voice from a generation that's going to be listened to, which helps give them a bigger, broader voice. But I think, talking to them and listening to them, building that into a plan will help all family businesses in the next stages of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think the other thing that I took from you as well was that you said it starts from day one. And literally, in terms of your retention and motivation, if you recruit the right people and you fulfill your part of the contractual discussion that you've had and meet their dream, because that's what you sold them, then you've got more chance of staying for longer.
Yeah, absolutely. And to make sure that those onboarding and induction phases have got a real, personal aspect to it as well. Just, because adjusting to, the 5-day week, your work might start here, finish here, all those kind of things. It might be a bigger transition than people realize. And by getting that right, you can generate tremendous word of mouth about what you do with others in their peer group. Yeah, and they can recruit for you.
I was going to say they can recruit for you, but they all speak your voice and they share it on social and everywhere else. So
absolutely.
Alex,
and it spreads fast.
Yeah, exactly, and it does. And but as always, you've given us lots of things to think about and take away. Obviously, people can get in touch with you. We'll share the details afterwards. From an FBU perspective and your time this morning, thank you so much for the honest
pleasure.
Appraisal. You obviously have some great connections from the school. I'm sure they're doing well given your guidance. But thank you once again for taking your time to share all your thoughts with us today.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul. Thank you. Bye, everybody.